All right, now, so here's a preview from 2023 GovCon conference.
We're here talking about small business, but there is so much more to this. Adrienne has experience navigating how the political aspect interacts with the actual execution of government. And she's so unique that they made a job just for her at the Department of Commerce. And they gave her $50 billion to oversee. And so
if only I was in charge of the entire $50 billion. But we'll say I am today.
we will talk about this. I want to make sure everybody knows just how important you are. This is a new role, and I want to give you a chance to maybe tell us about it and how it came about and why you think you were selected for the role. Over to you.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction. I really appreciate it. It's great to be with all of you today. As he mentioned, I run the External and Government Affairs vertical of the CHIPS Program Office at the Department of Commerce. And the way our office is set up was that we have a CHIPS Program Office Director, and then we have 5 verticals. So the vertical that I oversee includes public engagement, intergovernmental affairs, legislative affairs, and communications. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this job for President Biden and the administration is because I saw it as such a unique moment in really reimagining America's industrial policy when it comes to onshoring more jobs in the semiconductor industry. Some of you in this room may be somewhat familiar with the CHIPS and Science Act. Some of you may not be. It passed last year, last August, in a bipartisan manner, a very rare bill that passed in a bipartisan manner. Wish we had more of those. But Congress has been trying to pass this, and presidents have been trying to initiate Congress to pass this for the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, because we have lost so much of a market share in terms of manufacturing chips. In 1990, we manufactured nearly 30% of the world's chips. That doesn't mean designing them. We still have a significant market share in terms of how many chips we design here in the United States. But we manufactured 30%. That number today is 12%. I don't have to tell you all why that is not a good place to be. I think everybody in America really experienced what it's like to have a chip shortage in America on our own soil during the pandemic. When if you wanted to buy, something as simple as a dishwasher or a kitchen appliance of some sort or an electric vehicle, you name the device, oftentimes it took over a year to get that device to you. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the semiconductor, the chips that go into those devices, we couldn't get them because of supply chain disruptions. That not only impacts our economic security, but especially when it comes to military equipment, which does require highly sophisticated chips, it also impacts our national security. So when I was tapped to do this job, I really wanted to be a part of something that was unique in government. This is not a typical grant program where we are giving out, billions of dollars to almost any applicant that comes in. We're actually structuring deals with applicants so that we are not necessarily replacing capital, but we are trying to use capital to infuse and encourage even further reduction in the semiconductor industry, which I know we're going to get into here in a moment. Also, just to give you guys a quick recap, Congress authorized $52 billion for the CHIPS and Science Act. Our office is charged with distributing those funds. $39 billion of that goes to commercial incentives. So that's companies that are actually building the chips, manufacturing the chips, suppliers that create the network around semiconductor companies that are finishing off the chips, and then $11 billion goes to R&D. R&D is critically important because, again, we are designing a lot of the chips here in the United States, but it feels like it's almost an arms race when it comes to what other countries are doing. East Asia is also designing a lot of chips. It's a highly competitive industry. So we want to make sure that we're not just relying on companies to do the R&D, that we actually have an infrastructure here that really makes sure that we are at the cutting edge of all the emerging technologies when it comes to R&D, when it comes to the growing sophistication in the chips industry.
What a scene setter. I want to emphasize the bipartisan nature of this particular piece of legislation. Sometimes, for those that are not in the Washington arena, it can look fairly chaotic. This is an area where, no matter who you speak with in Congress, it's an area that people rally around and recognize that this is a big issue that is of national security concern and certainly of concern to our economy. It's uncommon, as Adrienne said, to have a piece of legislation that is so clearly bipartisan, but it is something that can bring us together. I think we had a slide that showed just the big picture of the split between the 50 billion. It's 39 and 11. Was that the number?
Yes.
How can companies get that down from an abstract level to something that they might be able to approach? And it may be that companies not directly seated here, but companies they work with are the ones that will have the best point of approach. But maybe you could help us understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just go through a quick recap of sort of how we've released these funding opportunities. We call them NOFOs in government speak, which stands for Notice of Funding Opportunity. But for all of you here, I will call it a funding opportunity. The first week on the job, I was like, what is a NOFO? And then finally somebody was like, it's a Notice of Funding Opportunity. So I always try when I'm speaking at events to make sure that we are destigmatizing some of these acronyms that we oftentimes use in government. So we released our first funding opportunity in February of this year, and that was for large-scale leading-edge and mature node companies. So these are the companies that are creating the most sophisticated chips in the world, the Samsungs, the Intels, the TSMCs. By the way, I should also add that 92% of the world's leading-edge chips, those are the chips that are in your iPhones, your laptops, your iPads, all of your smartphone devices, a lot of military equipment, some electric vehicles, like the super, super highly sophisticated chips, 92% of those are made at one fabrication facility, and that is in Taiwan. So I don't think anybody in this room needs to explain why that is not a good situation to be in for the long term. Again, that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we at least have an 8 to 10% market share on leading edge chips by the end of this decade. And we aim to do that through the CHIPS and Science Act. So we released our first funding opportunity in February of this year for large scale leading edge companies, mature node companies. We also amended that funding opportunity in June of this year to include large scale suppliers. And those are suppliers that have CapEx projects of over $300 million. The reason why is because we realized when we were starting to see some of the applications coming in that a lot of the applications that were coming in were not necessarily the chips producers themselves, but some of the very, very important suppliers and the people that make the equipment that makes the chips, the people that, the entities that have a small little role in creating a chip, but they're still a large-scale supplier and they are truly integral to the supply chain of actually creating a chip. We wanted to make sure that they had the same funding opportunities that some of these larger companies did. And then I think what's probably relevant for a lot of you in this room is 2 weeks ago, we released our smaller supply chain notice of funding opportunity for smaller businesses. These are businesses that have CapEx projects under $300 million. These are also a lot of women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. We do have in statute and law that we have to make sure that we are prioritizing businesses that are owned by women, that are owned by that are minority-owned businesses. So we are hoping that we will see a lot of applications that fit that bill. That's a huge priority for us. So these are the smaller businesses that have, an important component when it comes to strengthening the chip supply chain, but are not the big behemoth companies that are actually creating the chips.
From the land of acronyms, that was a new one for me, but CHIPS actually stands for something here aside from semiconductor chips. I had to write it down. Creating helpful incentives to produce semiconductors, the CHIPS Act. Adrienne, you're describing something that sounds like very high dollar value investment, and it can seem like it's a bit out of reach for small business. However, I would offer that if you can communicate with your government buyers in a knowledgeable way about what this program is all about and what it's trying to do and how it can help and how it affects your supply chains and the economy, you gain credibility because there are a lot of your buyers who can't explain it in these terms. And so being able to understand what are these very large programs that have national and international ramifications. Some people wonder, what does China-Taiwan mean to me? Adrienne just described it for you. Adrienne, maybe you could just tell us what are some of the research and development sort of things that are happening under the auspices of this act?
So we have not released our R&D Notice of Funding Opportunity, NOFO. We have not released that yet, and that's going to come out later this year. And that's going to be a really big deal because that's where, smaller businesses that are doing a lot of the research and development when it comes to, the smaller aspects of creating a chip, That's where obviously academic institutions can apply. And also as part of that, we're creating a $5 billion, we're calling it the NSTC, and this is going to be sort of an R&D facility that is a one-stop shop for sort of consolidating all the advancements that are happening in the semiconductor industry. And I think one of the things that's really exciting to us about small businesses here is every time you see an ecosystem of semiconductor activity, you know, obviously Arizona right now, right outside of Phoenix, and to an extent inside of Phoenix, TSMC, which is the Taiwan-based company I mentioned earlier that creates those super sophisticated leading-edge chips. TSMC and Intel are building out huge fabs in Arizona or in the Phoenix area. Ohio, the greater Columbus area, has a huge hub of semiconductor activity. Intel is building out a big fab there. Samsung is building out a huge fab in Taylor, Texas, right outside of Austin. Micron is investing a ton of money in upstate New York. I mean, the trickle-down effect of this investment that these companies are making in this region is going to help small businesses everywhere. And it's not just going to help small businesses that work in the semiconductor space. I actually heard an interesting statistic when the Austin Chamber of Commerce came to us a couple months ago and sort of presented, you know, how their economy is going to grow big time from the Samsung fab that's being built. They said for every job that is created in this fab, and by the way, a fab is short for, it's basically the acronym, or not even the acronym, it's the nickname for what a factory is. So like a factory where semiconductors or where chips are made is called a fab. They said for every job that is created at that fab, 6 jobs will be created directly or indirectly from that investment, which is huge. So that means the service industry is going to benefit. That means every small business is going to benefit. The region is going to just boom with job growth. And that's something else that we want to make clear. Even if you're not working or doing something in the semiconductor industry, your small business is going to benefit from these investments.
Adrienne, we see on the slide there's a red line that says workforce development that spans both of those very well-funded verticals. What sorts of activities count as workforce development? Is it something that we can touch or that we can access, or is it under development, or not as though it's underdeveloped, but is it still in development is what I meant.
I'm so glad you asked this question. Workforce to us is critically important. We look at all of our funding decisions primarily through the lens of national and economic security for all the reasons that I laid out. Commercial viability is also critically important. We want to make sure that we are investing taxpayer dollars in businesses and companies that are not going to go belly up in a couple of years. So understanding the commercial viability of an investment is very important to us. But also, we are requiring that all of our applicants seeking funds over $150 million put forth a workforce plan. Part of that plan includes how are you going to train the next generation of semiconductor workers so that, for example, if we are investing in, you know, a fab that's being built, if we are investing in an ecosystem of suppliers that are surrounding a large-scale fab that's being built, if we're doing that in a tight unemployment market, you know, some states have less than 3% unemployment, which is a good problem to have. But if you can't actually fill the jobs that we are investing taxpayer dollars in, then what are we doing? So we are requiring that all applicants seeking, you know, a significant amount of money put forth a workforce plan. That includes how are you going to partner with local high schools and community colleges to train the next generation of workers. We are estimating, that upwards of 60% of the jobs that are created through the CHIPS and Science Act do not require a college degree, which is incredibly exciting. And we hope that that will, you know, really, you know, help people who have, you know, maybe were working at an auto plant or have this really incredible manufacturing job, but for the last 10 or 15 years since the factory they were working at closed, they're doing something that doesn't really rise to their level of skills. So we're hoping that we can train that generation of workers along with the next generation of workers to work in these fabs. And some of these jobs start out paying $40,000 a year with a lot of upward mobility, which is super exciting. But again, going back to my original statement, which is if we're investing all these money in these fabs and we can't fill the jobs, then what are we doing? So we want to see applicants putting forward a workforce plan that takes into account training, partnering with community colleges and local high schools, you know, getting creative with state and local governments. We do require, we don't require much, but we do require that you show that there is state and local support when you apply for something. So if you're a company applying for funds, We want to understand, do you have the support from some of your state and local elected officials? Do you have the support from your economic development agencies? Do you have the support from some of your other large-scale companies that are also applying for funds? Workforce is critically important to us. It's something that we worry about a lot. There is a shortage in the semiconductor industry currently. If we are estimating that this, the CHIPS and Science Act is going to create at least 50,000 jobs in the semiconductor industry, if we can't fill those jobs, then it is a challenge. So for all of you in this room that are working a little bit in the workforce space, I encourage you to up that big time, because I think, number one, there is, certainly economic opportunities there to be made, but it's also something that's incredibly important to us that we have people at the state and local level all the way up to the national level that are really thinking through how are they going to train this next generation of workers.
Adrienne, is that funding bounded by some time constraints? So you talk about the number of jobs that need to be filled. Is that's over a certain time horizon, and then the funding that's available, it's alive in perpetuity, or it has a fixed lifespan? How does that work?
I mean, as far as we're concerned, we're hoping to get the money out the door as soon as possible. When you look at how much China's investing, they don't have to go through the same legislative process that we have to go through in the United States. They can just put whatever money they want to put in, government money, into the semiconductor industry whenever they choose. So we do feel like we are in this constant race with other countries. So we want to get this money out the door as soon as possible. It does depend on how quickly applications come in, the strength of those applications, so it really is on the applicants. Our office is funded for 4 years. So we've been around for slightly more than a year. So we are hoping that we can get this money out the door as quickly as possible, but it does truly depend on how quick the applications come in.
We're going to shift gears a little bit. Cybersecurity affects all of us, right? And government compliance with cyber protocols is something that costs small businesses quite a lot of money. There are elements of this bill that address cybersecurity issues. Is there something you can share on that front for us?
Can you be a little bit more specific?
Is there
is there funding for cybersecurity?
Is there funding that will address that issue in industry that would help ease some of the concerns about cybersecurity? What are the plans for cyber within the CHIPS Act?
So we don't necessarily have funds that address cybersecurity. I mean, our funds can be used somewhat liberally, but we don't necessarily have that. We do have funds for workforce training and development, which is great. I think it really depends on what the issue is and what what the application looks like. DoD does have a significant cybersecurity program, and they do have some funds for the CHIPS, not necessarily out of the CHIPS and Science Act, but some funds that are relevant to what we're doing. And we are working closely with DoD to make sure that we're partnering up on this. There is a whole of government approach when it comes to housing. This is not necessarily related to cybersecurity, but I was just on a panel yesterday in Columbus, Ohio, where we were talking about how are we going to make sure that we have the housing, whether it's temporary short-term housing for construction workers, whether it's long-term housing for a lot of the new jobs that are going to be created. How is that process going to work? So that's an example of where HUD doesn't necessarily have a stake in terms of how the money is being spent, the $52 billion, but they do have a lot to say when it comes to how are they going to make sure that they are using their funds to invest in housing, affordable housing in some of these areas where we are, just jobs are going to explode and there's going to be a housing issue, and how can they play a part in that? I will say on our strategy vertical, our strategy and policy vertical, that we have a number of cybersecurity experts who, of course, are looking through the applications and making sure that cybersecurity is at the forefront of applicants' minds, that they do have plans in place to protect to protect some of the chips that they're developing, and that we can keep we can keep some of the technology that we're developing out of the hands of bad actors. We've also put in place China guardrails. This is critically important because we're always in a song and dance with China where we need them, and we've made it clear that we're not going to decouple from China when it comes to chips. A lot of the chips that they manufacture are the chips that we all use in our everyday lives, especially some of the lower grade chips that you find in ceiling fans and some of the your kids' toys and hair dryers and things like that. Just sort of like everyday appliances. that China does have a market share on producing those chips, and that's fine. Our focus is more of the highly sophisticated leading edge chips. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we are keeping some of the highly technical R&D that we're learning out of the hands of China, and I think a lot of that does sort of portend into the cybersecurity space.
So there was a pretty big cyber answer there.
More than I realized when I put it all together.
So we knew you were an expert communicator before you ever walked on stage. But your role is Director of External and Government Affairs for the Chips for America Act, or for Chips for America office within the Department of Commerce. Maybe for those of us who don't operate at the highest levels of a cabinet of government, maybe you could just describe your role. You talked about being in Ohio. I know that outreach is certainly a part of the job, but who do you communicate with within government?
So it's interesting. Our office is kind of walled off from the application process, and one of the reasons why we are is because it allows us to go out and speak to groups like all of you, and interface with not only interface with applicants, but interface with potential applicants. Sort of answer some of the questions that a lot of people have. The reason why we are walled off is because we want to be able to have those interactions with members of Congress, with governors and mayors and state and local elected officials, with members of the media, et cetera. So we are kind of walled off from the application process. What is our role? I have a team of about 30 people. Public engagement, that vertical underneath the external and government affairs vertical is the team that is interacting with outside organizations, with trade associations, with think tanks,